Hello everybody and welcome back. We are going to be talking about the endocrine system and chemical control of the body in this lecture, chapter 38. So let's go ahead and get started. So we're first going to start talking about the different ways that cells can communicate to each other. This chapter is going to focus just on one of them, the endocrine method, but let's take a look at some of the other ways that cells can communicate just so we know that there's other options out there. So the first one is called direct cell communication. My little pointer here. So direct cell communication is just like as the name implies, the two cells are physically touching each other and they're going to send messages through open channels, usually gap junctions. Those are like little tunnels that are between the two different plasma membranes. We talked a little bit about direct contact in the last lecture when we were going over the lymphatic system and how natural killer cells destroy their target cells. They physically contact each other, but that was for a destructive mechanism. For a communication mechanism, these ions or signaling molecules will actually flow between the cells themselves, but they have to be physically touching for that to happen. The next example is synaptic communication. We'll see this a little bit more when we get into the nervous system towards the end of the term. But the chemical messenger in a neuron to other cell signaling are called neurotransmitters. And you've probably heard of some of these before, like dopamine and serotonin, acetylcholine, epinephrine, or adrenaline. Those are all examples of neurotransmitters. They are released from into a synapse, which is a small little space between the neighboring cells. So they don't touch. So direct contact is cell touching. Synaptic communication, there's no touching, but they're really, really close. So this picture over here, the top picture, is showing the end of one of these neurons. So there's this little, it's called the synaptic knob. So that's what we're looking at here. And all these little pink vesicles, they're little packages full of neurotransmitter. And what's going to happen when this neuron fires and it's ready to communicate to this, what's called the postsynaptic cell, this adjacent cell here, all of those vesicles filled with neurotransmitter will exocytose. They actually spew out all of their neurotransmitter into that little cleft. It crosses that space and the receiving cell picks up that chemical message and it will trigger it to communicate and do its thing. So that's what this over here, this is the receiving cell. So that's synaptic communication. It's very specific to neurons, either neuron to neuron, or it might be neuron to muscle, or a neuron to a gland. It's telling those cells what to do based on the release of the neurotransmitter. The third option is called paracrine. Paracrine is a local communication. So it's just going to be in a very isolated, small location. It's long distance. It's just kind of your close-in cellular neighbors. They're called local hormones. Sometimes they're called factors. Sometimes they're called prostaglandins or paracrine factors. They can be even the same molecule. So you can have the same molecule be a neurotransmitter or a paracrine factor. It just depends on where it's being released into. If it's going into a synapse, it's a neurotransmitter. If it's going into the local neighborhood, it's going to be called a paracrine factor or a local hormone. So prostaglandins, histamines, those are examples of the paracrine. Just your neighbors, just shouting out to, hey, cells, what's going on right next door? We're not talking about to anybody far away. And then the last type of cell communication, the one we're going to spend the rest of the chapter on, is called endocrine. So endocrine is the same type of signaling cell. It's releasing its hormone, right, endocrine hormones. But here the difference is those hormones are going to be traveling into the bloodstream. So in paracrine, they're just chilling out with their local cell neighbors. In endocrine, they can get carried to the entire body very, very quickly because they're jumping into the red blood cell highway, so to speak. So they're jumping into the arteries or veins or capillaries, I should say capillaries because that's where they go into, which will then be traveling through the arteries and veins. And they can carry anywhere in the body. Some examples of endocrine hormones are insulin, estrogen, growth hormone, testosterone, again, epinephrine or norepinephrine, depending on if it's going into the bloodstream or if it's going into a synapse. The picture that I have here on the bottom, this is a histological slide of the pancreas. This is one of the organs we're going to be talking about today. And all the dark pink that is not endocrine tissue. This light pink, these little blobs of light pink is what I wanted to focus on. These are what's called pancreatic islets, and they're what release the hormone insulin into our bloodstream to help regulate our blood sugar. So we're going to be looking about that, talking about that a little bit later. So this would be the endocrine portion of the pancreas. The reason why is because it releases its hormone into the bloodstream. There's a little capillary, that little white space right there. That's a capillary. That little white space, that's a capillary. Here's a little bit of a larger arterial right here. So those hormones are going to get dumped into the bloodstream to then communicate with other organs that can be all the way on the other side of the body. So before we jump into focusing more on the endocrine method or the different types of hormones and things like that, I wanted to just talk a little bit about the foundational idea of how all of this works. So how do chemical messengers work? Well, we have the messengers themselves. Usually it could be called a hormone or a paracrine factor or a signaling molecule, whatever it happens to be. And then we have the other part to this kind of relationship called the receptor. So we saw this a little bit in the lymphatic system or the defense against disease chapter earlier, where you have your receptors that are recognizing the antigens, right? So the receptors on the T cells or the receptors on the B cells are only recognizing that antigen, or the antibodies are only recognizing the antigen. It's the same type of deal, but the receptors in this case are embedded in the wall of the target cell, the cell that you want to tell that message to. And the messengers are going to be hormones in this case, or neurotransmitters if you're in the synapse. So let's say we have two hormones in this first picture here. We have hormone A is a red rectangle. We have hormone B, which is a green triangle. So their shape is different, kind of geometrically, but molecularly, know that molecules have different shapes, just like we have different shapes in geometry. So target cell A, I guess, for hormone A, here's a little receptor, it's kind of the orangey pink, and we can see its shape matches that of the shape of the hormone A molecule. It's that lock and key kind of puzzle piece type connection. And then we can see hormone B is this triangular kind of pointy shaped molecule, and the receptor for hormone B has that matching shape. So if you are a cell that you only have the blue receptors with that pointy shape, you're only going to be able to respond to hormone B. So if only hormone A is flooding around the cells, this cell is not going to respond. It has no receptors for that. If you only have the ones that can recognize hormone A, you are not going to be able to recognize or do anything with hormone B. This cell in the middle, because it has both, it could respond and have an outcome if hormone A or B comes down the line. So it has multiple receptors. So keep that in mind when we talk about kind of systemic body-wide. All of our cells have different kinds of receptors programmed for the type of cell they are. So if you are a liver cell, you will most likely have receptors for insulin and glucagon because you're the sugar storage, and insulin and glucagon regulate blood glucose levels. Bone cells, you're going to have receptors for PTH and calcitonin because your bones are the storage bank for calcium, and you have to be able to listen to the messages that our bodies are sending to tell us about our calcium levels. This picture over here is just kind of showing the same idea, just slightly different, including our endocrine delivery system with our hormone, these little green house-shaped things, through the bloodstream, diffuses out of the capillary. It's going to find the target cell. So here we've got a receptor that's kind of rounded with a receptor site, and over here we've got the receptor site that's a little bit pointy. So these are the target cells for this particular hormone, and these are not target cells. So they're just going to go about their daily business. They're not going to be active to any of this little green hormone that's coming through. So that's kind of like the foundation of how this chemical messaging works. All right, so then focusing specifically on endocrine, remember the key idea for endocrine, if you can remember anything about endocrine, is the signals go through the blood. That's the whole point. So your signaling cell will release the hormone, it goes into the blood carries it throughout the body, diffuses out of the capillaries, and binds to the target cell because it has the right receptor, right? So that's your key. The hormone binds to the receptor, is delivered to the target cell via the bloodstream. So here's, again, just another example. We're hitting this idea home. So here's your gland. So maybe this is your, if we're going to the uterus, maybe this is oxytocin, or maybe this is progesterone, or maybe this is estrogen coming from the ovary. So here's the organ releasing, we'll call estrogen, into the bloodstream. Estrogen can go anywhere the blood goes, and it diffuses out of the capillary into the tissues. And so here's the uterus that has the receptors that match estrogen. So then the uterus will reply or respond or have an effect, whatever it's programmed to do in the presence of estrogen, it will do that. Here's our skeletal muscle. It has receptors, but not for estrogen. So these little square-shaped ones will not respond. So remember, these hormones go throughout your whole body, but only the cells with the proper receptors are the ones that are going to respond to that message. All right, so now let's take a look at what the kind of shapes, or what are these hormones made out of. There's 3 classes of hormones kind of based on their chemistry, based on their molecular structure. So the first type are called steroid hormones, and these are probably the ones that you are most familiar with in kind of like layman's terms when we talk about people who are on steroids, especially being abused by in the athletic world. So steroid hormones are synthesized from a precursor molecule called cholesterol, which is a lipid that's found in, you know, fatty foods and things like that. So this is just, I'm just showing you these molecular pictures just for interest purpose. You don't have to know their actual chemical structure unless you really are into that. So here's what testosterone looks like. It's a huge molecule. It's got 19 carbons, 28 hydrogens, and 2 oxygens. So this would be an example of testosterone being synthesized from the base molecule cholesterol. Cholesterol is actually this 5-ring chain, and it's these offshoots that make it different. Estrogen looks very much like this, but these side chains are a little bit different. The next group of hormones are called peptide hormones, and again, if you took 101, you might be familiar with the word peptide. It's how we describe proteins are made up of repeating units of amino acids held together by peptide bonds. So chains of amino acids. So this is a even bigger molecule. So each one of these little circles is an amino acid, which in itself is about this size down here, because epinephrine is like the size of 1 amino acid. So this is insulin. It's huge, and it is what we call a peptide hormone because it's made up of a whole bunch of amino acids held together by peptide bonds. And then the last group are called amino acid derived hormones. All that means is it is a hormone that's been its original molecule was an amino acid that has been modified a little bit, so it's no longer considered an amino acid. It is now a signaling molecule. So epinephrine, which is also called adrenaline, this is your amino acid derivative. So this little bit right here with the nitrogen, this would be the base molecule of where the amino acid came from, and the ring is kind of like the added bit, the modified piece of that original amino acid. So we've got steroid hormones, peptide hormones, and amino acid derived hormones. Before we go to the next couple slides, I just want to talk about kind of going back to, again, diffusion, hopefully, if you remember your 101 stuff, things that what we call lipid soluble were able to diffuse through that phospholipid bilayer, right? Since we're talking about cell communication, we got to jump back to the cellular level and understand that plasma membrane. So lipid soluble things that can move through that hydrophobic middle part, they can actually diffuse through that membrane. Things that are large or charged or are big in size, like insulin and this polar epinephrine molecule, they cannot diffuse through the plasma membrane. So these different classes, the lipid-based steroid versus the water-based or the protein-based other 2 classes, they have to communicate to their target cells differently. So that's what we're going to take a look at next. Right? So let's focus on steroid hormones. So think of, testosterone like we just saw in the last picture, estrogen, progesterone, cortisol, aldosterone, whatever steroid hormone is your favorite. So let's pretend that's this green guy right here. So here's we're outside of the cell in kind of this tan interstitial space. Here's our plasma membrane of the cell, right? Here's our phospholipid bilayer. Here's the cytoplasm is the blue, and the purple is our nucleus. So kind of set yourself, we're in the middle of a cell here. For these steroid hormones, I kind of pointed the key things here. These steroid hormones, because they're lipid soluble, they can diffuse directly through the plasma membrane. They have receptors, but they're not on the outside of the cell. They actually would diffuse all the way into the nucleus before they find the receptor. Relationship is still the same. If this is testosterone, it will only bind to a testosterone receptor. It just happens to be inside of the cell, in this case, all the way inside of the nucleus. This testosterone receptor complex, hormone receptor complex, will bind to the DNA, modifies gene expression, makes some proteins, and that's how we get the effect from the cell. Binds to receptors in the nucleus, brings about change in gene expression, right? We're going to be expressing a gene to make a new protein product, or change the behavior of the cell, or maybe tell the cell to go through mitosis, or tell the cell to turn off or turn on a particular gene. So think of steroid hormones as more of like a genetic regulator. It changes how your genes are expressed, just for steroid hormones. Compare that to the other two classes of our peptide hormones, like our insulin or epinephrine. They're going to function this way. So again, here's our setting. The tan space is outside of the cell. That's the interstitial fluid. The blue space is the cytoplasm. The purple space is the nucleus. So here, because they're large in size or they're polar, they cannot diffuse through the plasma membrane. Those receptors are located on the surface. So they're bound to receptors on the surface of the cell. Hormone binds right here. So that's our step 1. Step 2 and 3, we have all of this kind of chain reaction stuff that's happening inside the cell. It's called a transduction pathway. So all of this busy kind of chemical reactions take place, and then the change is usually going to be a couple different outcomes. You might change the permeability of the cell, like it might open channels to allow sodium to rush in or calcium to rush in or out, or it could change metabolism by activating enzymes. So this little orange enzyme is the end result of all of these arrows, and then the enzyme can make a product. So maybe that's activating ATP production, or changing some other process inside of the cell. So kind of the takeaway from these last 2 slides is steroid hormones modify or regulate gene expression. Peptide hormones regulate or modify cell metabolism, are kind of these 2 categories of outcomes that we can get from these cells, from these hormones. So let's take a look at the structures of the endocrine system. So what do they entail? Well, this is a body system, so it's going to have organs, and there's a lot of endocrine organs. So there's quite a few up here in the brain. We have what's called the pineal gland, the hypothalamus, and the pituitary gland, which we'll be talking about these more specifically. We have our thyroid and parathyroid glands located right here in our neck area. We have our thymus, sits over the heart, kind of sitting above or superior to the heart. We have our adrenal glands, we have our pancreas, and we have our reproductive organs, our gonads, the testes and the ovaries. These other ones that are listed, heart, kidneys, digestive tract, and fat, I put a box around them just because I wanted you to see and separate them. These are organs that are primarily known to be found in other body systems, right? So the heart is part of the cardiovascular system, the kidneys are part of the urinary system, your stomach and small intestines are part of the digestive system. Your fat can be also part of the digestive system. We talked about that. So we can have organs that are found in other systems, but they can have endocrine functions. These other ones, for the most part, they're all endocrine. That's like their whole job. Thyroid gland doesn't do really anything else but endocrine. Your thymus really doesn't do anything else but endocrine. Your adrenal glands really don't do anything else but endocrine. So they are part of the endocrine system. Where these ones, your heart's major job is to pump blood, not to secrete hormones. Okay. So we'll see these again towards the end. The end of the chapter talks about some of these organs from other hormones from other organs. So we're going to first kind of start in the brain. We're going to talk about the hypothalamus and the pituitary. So I've given you a picture of the brain, how it sits in the head, and I think we do nervous system towards the end of this class. So right down, kind of right smack in the middle, if we go like here's our eyeballs, we go straight back into the middle of our brain. We have this little dangly part of our brain hanging off, and this is called the pituitary gland. And it is continuous to this actual physical part of the brain, and that's called the hypothalamus. This whole area right here is called the thalamus. Here's your hypothalamus. Here's your pituitary gland. So sometimes this is called the master gland because it produces and secretes a lot of hormones, where most endocrine organs might secrete 1 or 2, maybe 3. The pituitary gland, both the front and the back, produce about 9 or secrete 9 different hormones, 8 to 9, depending on your book. All right, so the master gland, it controls a lot of different parts of our body. So let's dive a little bit deeper into the pituitary gland. So It is divided physically and physiologically, so I should say anatomically and physiologically, into what we call the anterior lobe, because that's sitting more towards the front of the brain. So that's this kind of pinkish highlighted part. So this is the anterior lobe, and this is the posterior lobe. So it's on the back half of that structure, and then the hypothalamus sits up here. So the anterior lobe produces most of the hormones from the pituitary gland. We have listed 6 here. There's a 7th one, but your book doesn't cover it, so I'm not going to mention it. So these ones, all of these hormones have abbreviations. You don't need to know the abbreviations or really their functions. We're just, I'm just trying to be complete here. But a lot of them do a lot of control. So I'm going to go over them because your book just briefly mentions that, but I'm not going to, the expectation will be not that you will memorize all of these hormones. So we have follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, prolactin, and growth hormone. That's a lot. So all of those hormones are made from these little cells. They're kind of indicated by the orange and the pink clusters here. This whole anterior lobe is jam-packed of these cells, and each cell will make their own hormone. They don't make all 6. So you're going to have a group of cells that will make just growth hormone. You'll have a group of cells that just make thyroid stimulating hormone. So they're hanging out in their anterior lobe. There are cells up in the hypothalamus, these neurons, because the hypothalamus is part of your brain. It's a neural tissue. It secretes its own kind of signaling molecules. They're hormones because they're traveling through blood. And they come down and tell, hey, orange cell, you need to secrete some growth hormone. And off it goes into the blood, out to the rest of the body. Okay, yellow cell, you need to be secreting your TSH. We got to increase our blood, our body temperature. You go and stimulate the thyroid gland. So these little green molecules will stimulate those yellow cells to release its hormone. So that's how the anterior lobe works. The hypothalamus kind of hormonally stimulates these cells to release their hormones. It's a complicated relationship, a complicated pathway, multi-step pathway, I should say. The posterior lobe hormones, there's only 2 of those. They are called oxytocin and ADH, or anti-diuretic hormone. Their secretion is a little bit different. Instead of these hypothalamic hormones secreting their signaling molecules into the blood, they actually secrete they make the hormone. So these cells up here actually make the ADH and oxytocin, secrete that into the blood, and that goes out to the body. So a slightly different process of origin and secretion, but the outcome is the same. The hormones will go into the bloodstream and then go out to the body and target whatever they need to target. The next pair of organs we're going to take a look at sits right here in your throat, right below your voice box. It's called your thyroid gland. On the back side, we have your parathyroid glands. So your thyroid gland is kind of this big, kind of wing-shaped, horseshoe-shaped, sits kind of like this, just wrapped around the anterior surface of your trachea, right below your voice box. And on the back side of it, there's 4 little bean-shaped glands called the parathyroid glands. They're embedded in the back wall of the thyroid gland. Your thyroid gland secretes 2 groups of hormones. One's called thyroxines, and the other one is calcitonin. So thyroxine helps to regulate your body temperature and metabolism. Calcitonin, you guessed it, helps to regulate calcium. And then parathyroid glands release what's called PTH, parathyroid hormone, and that also helps to regulate calcium. We're going to see both of those processes coming up next. So here we're going to focus on the job of the thyroxine hormones. So this actually is regulated by one of our pituitary gland hormones called TSH. So TSH stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. So here, let's say we have your body is getting low in body temperature or lower in overall metabolism, and we want to speed that up. So your brain's recognizing that. We've got that thermostat. Remember, we were talking about fever, and that thermostat regulates, can monitor your body temperature. So if your body temperature gets too low, one of the ways it can help bring that up is these hypothalamic cells will trigger the pituitary gland to release thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone goes into the blood, goes and tells the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone. That's little black circles. Thyroid hormone goes out to all of your body cells, increases metabolism. The more heat, your body is warming up. And so you're going to have a negative feedback mechanism by your body temperature. You also have a negative feedback mechanism by the thyroid stimulating the thyroxine itself. High levels of thyroxine will go and inhibit the message to release thyroxine. Right? Another thing that we need to take into account is this relies on iodine levels. Iodine is a big part of the thyroxine molecular structure. So that's why in most westernized cultures we have iodized salt. Because if you don't have enough iodine, your thyroid gland's like, I need to make more hormone, but I'm trying, and the thyroid glands gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and then you end up with what's called a goiter. There's a really good picture of that in your textbook, and so that's usually due to iodine deficiency. We don't see that too much in our kind of modernized Western civilization because it's really, really cheap to put iodine in our salt. So whenever you buy your little salt in the blue salt shaker, it should say iodized salt. And so we get that little bit of iodine that we need to maintain our thyroid hormone levels. The last bullet point here is sometimes your thyroid gland isn't working properly. If it's not producing enough thyroid hormone, it's called hypothyroidism. If it's producing too much thyroid hormone, it's called hyperthyroidism. And these levels, if you're on two of those extremes, it can have system-wide, body-wide effects because all of your cells are going to have receptors for the thyroxine hormone. And if you don't have enough or you have too much, it's going to impact all of those cellular functions. The other thing that the thyroid and parathyroid glands kind of work together to do is to regulate your blood calcium levels. So let's say we have homeostasis. Our blood calcium levels are right where they're supposed to be. But then for some reason, we're not eating our green leafy vegetables, or we're not consuming our high calcium dairy products. So our blood levels of calcium are going to get too low. Well, our parathyroid glands, those are the four little bean-shaped things on the back of the thyroid, they're going to recognize that. They're like, hey, blood calcium level's too low. We got to fix that. We can't get too low blood calcium. So it releases your PTH, goes and targets your bone, because that's where almost all 99% of our calcium is stored in our bone. It causes the bone to release that blood calcium, bringing us back to homeostasis, right? So we use the calcium that's stored in our bones as needed. Now, on the flip side of that, which doesn't happen as often, is what if your blood calcium levels are too high? We can't have too high of calcium. We want to stay in homeostasis. So a hormone from the thyroid gland called calcitonin comes in and triggers the release of calcium through the urine, right? So we talked about urine, the proximal tubule and the distal tubule. That's where calcitonin goes to act and say, hey, any calcium that's coming through here, just pee it on out. We've got to bring down our blood calcium levels because we have too much. So between calcitonin from the thyroid gland and parathyroid hormone from the parathyroid glands, we have to maintain a normal, healthy blood calcium level. This diagram over here is kind of cool because it shows the bone, but also just kind of related to this, if we have a reduced amount of calcium intake, dietary intake, so if you're not taking in calcium, your body's going to keep releasing that PTH. And where's the PTH going to go to try to get more calcium to maintain our homeostasis? It's going to target your bone. So if you have normal, healthy dietary intake of calcium, your bones are going to be over here on the left. They're going to be healthy, they're going to be strong, and they're going to be dense, and they will last you for your whole life. If you don't have enough calcium taken in, and as you age, your hormones are going to keep trying to keep your blood calcium levels high, and if you're not taking in with your diet, where's it going to come from? Well, it's going to start eating away at your bone. And so here we can see what's called osteopenia, which is less dense bone. Here we can see osteoporosis, which is really dense bone. And here is severe osteoporosis, where even like sneezing or bumping into somebody or getting a strong hug can break bones, let alone a fall, right? So as people age, they lose their balance. So if you want to maintain good, healthy, strong bones for the rest of your life, maintain your dietary intake of calcium so you're not relying on PTH to dig away and eat away at your stored calcium in your bones. Keep healthy bones. All right, the next organ we're going to take a look at is the pancreas. We saw the pancreas back in the digestive system. It's one of our accessory structures to the gastrointestinal tract. We talked about how it releases enzymes to help break down all of our food and get absorbed a little bit later in the jejunum. Right, all these keywords from prior chapters. This time we're going to focus primarily on the endocrine portion, which is like 1% of the pancreas is just endocrine, a little islet picture that I showed at the beginning of the lecture. So there's two hormones that are primarily responsible for maintaining blood glucose. They are insulin and glucagon. So let's start by saying you're going to have this ice cream sundae or whatever the food. Food's got sugar in it, especially ones that are sugary. So you're eating this sugary food, increases your blood calcium levels. The pancreas is monitoring that. It's like, hey, we can't have too high of blood glucose. That can cause some problems. So it releases insulin into the blood. For this reaction, the major target is your liver and your skeletal muscle. So what happens is insulin goes to all these cells, binds to the receptor, causes those cells to open their glucose channels and say, hey, look at all this glucose. I'm going to take that in. And by doing that, it reduces your blood glucose levels back to normal, right? You just eat a whole bunch of sugar. The pancreas helps us get that sugar back out of the blood into our cells, primarily for storage. We store it in our liver and we store it in our skeletal muscle. So then let's say after a while, you've had your breakfast at 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock in the morning. It's now 1 o'clock. You have a late lunch. Oh, I'm starving. How do you maintain your blood glucose levels between breakfast time and lunchtime, or between lunch and dinner, or between dinner and breakfast? How do you do that if you're not actively eating? Well, all of that sugar that we stored up after our last meal, we can access that. And we do that by this other hormone called glucagon. So your in between meal time, our blood glucose levels get low. The pancreas recognizes that, releases glucagon, targets our storage tanks, right, our liver and our muscle, releases that glucose back into the blood to keep our blood glucose levels normal. So throughout the day, whether we're eating, whether we're fasting, whether we're sleeping, we can rely on these hormones, insulin for high blood glucose to get it back down, and glucagon for low glucose to get it back up, to help us maintain our normal blood glucose levels. Now, you may know, this could be you or somebody that you know has a disorder of the pancreas called diabetes. So this is a defective insulin control system. So your pancreas isn't doing what it's supposed to do, which means your blood glucose levels are not maintaining homeostasis. And so you could have these big swings of blood glucose too high or too low, and that's really damaging. It could be deadly even, or deteriorating for your nervous system, for your cardiovascular system, for your kidneys. So there's two major types of diabetes. You may have heard this before. Type 1, also known as juvenile or insulin-dependent diabetes. About 5% of all diabetes cases are type 1. This is where their pancreas does not work at all, and so they are constantly regulating their blood glucose via insulin injections, or they might have an insulin pump. Type 2 diabetes, which is the vast majority of people with diabetes, this is more, it's called insulin independent or adult onset. This is more due to a dietary and exercise regimen that did not bode well for your pancreas. A lot of times consuming high sugar foods or a lack of exercise, your pancreas started out working fine, but then over the years it got too used to having all this sugar, and the pancreas is like, I give up, I'm going to stop working correctly. So type 2 diabetics might be able to correct their blood sugar by changing their diet and their exercise routine. They may even lose the diagnosis of diabetic or pre-diabetic if they can regulate via exercise and diet. Very few type 2 diabetics progress on to the need for insulin. It's still possible. I'm not saying they don't, but it's not quite as important. That's not the right word. It's not as vital as a type 1 diabetic who has no insulin at all. Type 2 diabetics, lifestyle changes usually helps to keep their blood sugar levels stable. All right, the next group of organs we're going to take a look at are the reproductive organs. So your gonads, which are the testes in males, ovaries in females. So testes produce hormones, the androgens, which would be like testosterone, estradiol, and inhibin, and they help mainly to maintain your secondary sexual characteristics. They help with sperm production and libido. The female gonads of the ovary, progesterone, androsten, I'm not familiar with that word. It's like a female version of testosterone, estrogen, and inhibin. And so these hormones are going to, again, help maintain female secondary sexual characteristics. They help regulate your ovarian and uterine cycles, and they function during pregnancy, which we'll see on the other side. Is if a female is pregnant, the placenta will also release hormones. The placenta is a temporary organ of pregnancy, progesterones, estrogens, HCG, and inhibin, and human placental lactogen. And then the uterus itself will release prolactin and relaxin, helping loosening up those joints, getting ready for delivery. So your reproductive hormones primarily maintaining your reproductive system and the ability to make offspring. Our last gland are the adrenal glands. These sit atop your kidneys. So we learned about the kidneys in our urinary system. So sitting right on top like a little hat are your adrenal glands. They are made up of two physical parts. We have the cortex, which we learned in the kidneys is the outer layer. We have the medulla, which is the middle. So our adrenal gland also has a cortex and a medulla. There's couple different types of hormones that are secreted from the adrenal gland. In the cortex, we have steroid hormones, not estrogen and testosterone, that's reproductive steroid hormones. These are cortisol, which is a sugar regulator and a stress kind of response, and aldosterone, which is a water balance regulator. So it helps you maintain your water and electrolyte, fluid and electrolyte balance. And then the adrenal medulla, that's the middle part, this is going to be releasing your stress hormones like your adrenaline. Your epinephrine and adrenaline are the same thing. Norepinephrine and noradrenaline are the same thing. Your adrenal medulla helps to kind of guide your fight or flight response. So a crisis mode, are you going to fight? Are you going to run? Are you going to hide? Or exercise. Exercise kind of piggybacks on your fight or flight response. And then the last thing we're going to take a look at is that box that had hormones coming from organs from other body systems. So we've talked about erythropoietin back in the urinary system, right? So the EPO helps to regulate your red blood cell production. We talked about digestive tract hormones, the leptin and the ghrelin. We talked about that. There it is in the fat as well. So what I wanted to do, just real quick, you don't have to track this because I know it's pretty complex, but I just wanted to show how involved all of these hormone messages can be. So I'm going to focus on what's called atrial natriuretic peptide. This is from the heart, which we normally think is just the pump for the blood, but it actually can secrete a hormone. And this happens when your blood volume is too high. So if you have high blood pressure, high blood volume, your heart is stretching. It's getting a little bit fuller than it normally would. It's like, whoa, 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 this could go bad quickly. So let's get rid of some of our fluid. So what it does is it tells our blood vessels to relax, reducing blood pressure because we don't want to blow a gasket. It tells our kidneys to pee out water, right? So reduce that renin, reduce the aldosterone from your adrenal cortex. So we're going to pee out more water. And then it goes and tells the brain to stop releasing that ADH. We saw that in the urinary system. It's going to make you less thirsty and less motivated to eat salty food. So we're trying to lose water. So ANPs, your natriuretic peptides, are like natural diuretics. If your blood volume and blood pressure are too high, you just pee a lot, and that gets you back down to homeostasis. All right, so that wraps up our discussion on hormones and the endocrine system. So again, as we move through all of these chapters, I know it's a lot of material. Use the notes, the PowerPoints, the videos, the study guides. You have all of these resources to make sure you're keeping up with the material. Please send questions, emails, stop by office hour if you're on campus. I am happy to help. All right, I'll see you next time. Bye.